Hello everybody, this video is going to be on a technique called photoelectron spectroscopy. We usually abbreviate that as PES. This technique will allow us to look at some data to determine which elements are present and explain why it takes more or less energy to remove some of their electrons during this technique based on periodic trends. So the way this works is you have a big fancy machine that I wish I had one, but I don't. We won't get to do this in class. But we have a machine, we put our sample in, we expose it to a lot of energy. The electrons come out of the sample, they're removed from the atoms, and they go through an analyzer. And they're able to analyze the amount of energy that it took to remove those electrons. When we get our data, it will be in a form of a graph. On the y-axis, we'll have the number of electrons, and on the x-axis, we'll have the energy it took to remove the electron. We call that the binding energy. One thing that's a little bit weird is most of these graphs, the x-axis is almost in backwards order. It increases going to the left. Always double check though, because I have seen in both directions, okay? So always double check. The graph will look like a series of peaks. The height of the peak will tell us how many electrons are present. And the left to right placement will tell us the energy that it took to remove the electron, which we will then correlate to how close it is to the nucleus. Remember, the closer it is to the nucleus, the more attraction you have, so the higher energy to take away. So we'll be able to figure things out like that based on these little peaks. Each peak is going to represent the electrons present in a single sublevel. If you remember the energy level, right, that's like the big 1 through 7 numbers. And then the sublevels are like saying 1s, 2s, 2p, 3s, 3p. Not individual orbitals, but in that sublevel, that orbital shape, that type in that energy level. The larger the peak, the more electrons you have. That's a key thing to pay attention to here is the height of the peak. If the left side is the high energy, you can imagine here as the nucleus. I like drawing these kind of quarter circles for each peak. It really helps my brain visualize that that's one step further away from the nucleus. You don't have to, it's just something I've always liked to do. We can use this data to identify elements or to explain how their binding energies relate to their atomic structure. So here we have hydrogen and helium. You can see they each only have one peak, which makes sense because they each have just one sublevel, the 1s orbital. But if you notice, the height of these peaks is very different, isn't it? Hydrogen only has one electron in the 1s orbital, but helium has 2 electrons. You can see this peak here compared to this one. Helium's is twice as tall because there's twice as many electrons. It may not be perfectly exact because it is, data. These are little graphs that have been, scanned onto our worksheets and things, but you can see it's basically twice as high. You should also notice that the left to right placement of this peak is quite different. If you notice, hydrogen's peak is further to the right. Helium is further to the left. In this graph, our energy increases to the left, which means it took more energy to remove the electrons from helium than it did from hydrogen. let's think about our periodic trends. What do we know about the size of the atom as we move left to right? Well, it gets smaller, right? Because we have more protons pulling harder on those electrons, pulling that radius in smaller, more nuclear attraction, so it's harder to take them away. I can verify that that idea is true based on the left to right placement of these peaks, right? My 1 proton versus my 2 protons, my nucleus is stronger in helium. It takes more energy to remove the electron in helium because of that higher effective nuclear charge. So they love to use PES data to see if you can explain and justify your periodic trends. Now, let's look at oxygen. We know that oxygen has 3 sublevels. We have a 1s, we have 2s, and we have 2p. Therefore, we should see 3 peaks on our graph. The biggest peak means the most electrons. If you think about your electron configuration, you should be able to guess that the 2p peak will be the largest because there are 4 electrons here. And this should be twice as big as these peaks. Here's my graph. And that looks about like what I would expect. Here's my 1s. Here's my 2s. And this one is twice as tall. My 2p. Each peak corresponds to a piece of my electron configuration, doesn't it? Sometimes they get more and more complicated. The more and more electrons you get, the worse and worse it gets. But if you look at your electron configuration, we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sublevels, 7 pieces here. I should have 7 peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 peaks. Trying to identify the peaks, well, let's see, my energy increases on the left, so the furthest to the left should be the highest energy, closest to the nucleus, most energy, and we should be able to guess that the 2p and 3p should be the largest, because look how many electrons we have in there. We got 6 electrons in each of those sublevels. And the smallest peak on here should be the 3d. Because if you look, there's only one little tiny electron here. And what should my first peak be? My very first peak should be my 1s orbital. You can use the height of your 1s to figure out the relative heights of all the others. This has 2 electrons in it. Therefore, this must be a peak of too high, and this is too high, and this is too high. But this is only 1, isn't it? If you notice, this is half. So this is 1 electron. If you look at these 2 big tall ones, those are about 3 times bigger than my 1s, which tells me there's 6 electrons because this had 2, therefore 3 times bigger would be 6. So when I go through this, here's my 2 electrons in the 1s, here's my 2 electrons in the 2s, here's my 6 electrons in 2p, here's 2 electrons in 3s, 6 electrons in 2p, and now something weird happens. Look over here. This is one single electron, right? The smallest peak, which we know should be what? The 3d. And then this is left to be the 4s. Now, those are not in the same order as I write my configuration, are they? And that really messes people up. And that is because we need to stop and we need to think about what this graph is showing us and what a configuration is showing us. If you remember, a configuration we write in this order because that's the order that the electrons are placed into the orbitals. It's the order we fill the orbitals. But that's not what this graph is. These are out of order because this graph is showing us something different. This is not a graph of what order my orbitals fill. This is a graph of how much energy it takes to remove the electrons. Do you remember when we were writing configuration of ions? Right? We had to think about what order things fill and remove in. And I would have told you to take from the highest energy level first, take the 4s electrons first. Well, look, the 4s peak is a lot easier to take, isn't it? It's on the further to the right. That's why we remove them first. These are held onto tighter. That's why the 3d gets left for a little bit. The 3d electron shields that 4s electron, which makes it easier for the 4s to be removed, because if it's shielded by the 3d, that means the 4s is not being held onto as tightly. It has a lower binding energy. It's not being held onto by the nucleus as strong, so it can be removed easier. So be careful that you're not on autopilot. Don't be a little robot labeling your peaks in the same order as your configuration. When your configuration starts getting out of order up here, you got to start being careful down here. Why don't you look at this graph and try to think about which element this might be. Pause it and actually try it on your own. Use the height of the peaks, use the number of the peaks to help you figure out which element this might be. All right, did you get it correct? This was sodium. So let's think about how I figured that out. How many peaks did I have? I had 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's going to correspond to the 1s, 2s, 2p, and 3s. So then I start to look at the height of the peaks. If this is the 1s and that's 2 electrons, then this must also be 2. And if I look, peak A over here is half of that, so that's 1 electron over here. This really big peak was 3 times bigger, so that must have been 6 electrons. So I have 2, 2, 6, and 1. That tells me that my configuration is 1s2, 2s2, 2p6, 3s1. There are 11 electrons here. 2 plus 2 plus 6 plus 1. That's sodium. You will probably notice that the graph won't actually have numbers on the y-axis, which is annoying. It's not literally going to say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but you can use that first peak to find the relative size of the other peaks. So let me ask you another question. When you're looking at the size of these peaks, why was one of them much bigger than the other? Why was that third peak so big? Well, it's because it represented 6 electrons in that 2p level. The rest of those peaks are only representing 1 or 2 electrons, so there's a lot more electrons there. Which sublevel is peak A? Well, that's 3s. Those are all the types of questions that you might be asked, right? What type of, or what element is this? What type of sublevel is a certain peak representing? How many electrons are represented in a certain peak? They may ask you to explain why one peak is further to the left or to the right, things like that. Let's look at this one. The PES data below, not above, it's below, shows only the peak for the 1s electrons. Why is the peak for nitrogen further to the right? So why is nitrogen's 1s electron a lower binding energy than oxygen's? Pause the video and think about an answer. See if you can come up with an answer that has to do with the periodic trends that you know about when it comes to ionization energies. Think about the attractions here to that nucleus. All right, let's see if you got it. It takes less energy to remove the 1s electrons from nitrogen because it has a larger radius than oxygen. It has a lower effective nuclear charge, fewer protons, so there's less attraction between the nucleus and the electron in nitrogen than in oxygen. So make sure when you're giving answers to these, you reflect on the things I told you to be careful of writing periodic trends answers because they apply here. If they want you to compare two elements, make sure you mention the names of both elements. Make sure you're specific. Don't just say things like it, right? And then make sure you're referencing an actual explanation, not just vocab dropping. Don't just say lower effective nuclear charge. Explain how that results in a larger radius with less attraction. And also be careful because if they ask you to explain why nitrogen's peak is further to the right, but you explain why oxygen is further to the left, I honestly don't know if they'll give you credit for that. I think it might depend on what graders you get, right? So make sure you're answering the question in the direction and with the element that they're actually interested in. So be a little bit careful there. All right, last practice example. Maybe you have to draw the spectrum, okay? Give it a try. See if you can sketch it. Use your 1s orbital to be the guidepost that decides how big the other peaks are. I would use pencil, right? Give it a try. Pause the video if you need to. So what I would do is I would first write out the configuration because that will tell me that I need 3 peaks. Then I can look at my superscripts and I can say, okay, 1s2, 2s2, those peaks should be the same height. 2p1, that should be half as tall as these. Now the spacing between the peaks, you don't have data to know how far apart to spread them, so don't worry about that, okay? Focus on the order of the peaks and focus on the height of the peaks. And then don't do anything really weird, like squish 2 of them really close together and put one 6 feet apart, right? Just draw, a decently spaced graph the best that you can. Start with that 1s2 peak because that's going to dictate the size of the rest. And there you go. Here's my 1s, my 2s, and half as tall is my 2p. It takes a little bit of practice with these because you've never seen them before, so make sure you pay good attention when you get one of these problems. You should always double check, please double check that your energy is increasing to the left. If not, then everything's mirror image, right? You would flip everything. If your energy is increasing to the right, flip your graph. Okay? All right, everybody, I hope that was helpful. Bye.